Well, it's Healthcare Unfiltered, and I couldn't be happier to have Gardiner Harris, an amazing investigative journalist, huge career that we're going to go over. But the purpose of one of the reasons for this podcast is your New York Times bestseller, No More Tears. Gardner, I did shed few tears, sorry to say, but I'll tell you why. Tell us a bit about you and what got you into journalism.
Oh, what got me into journalism? I graduated when my first job out of college was on Wall Street, and I hated it. And then I got a marketing job, and the most fun I had in the marketing job was writing. And when that kind of naturally came to an end, I decided I'd try journalism. And that my first journalism job was actually at a TV station in Los Angeles. And I didn't really like that. The reporters spent as much time in the makeup trailer as they did on the story, and it wasn't kind of where my priorities were. And then so I tried a job at a tiny little newspaper up in San Luis Obispo, California, which is a beautiful place anyway. And I just knew I'd found what I wanted to spend the rest of my life doing. I have to say, I kept it. It felt like a summer job. It was so much fun, and I kept thinking that I was going to have to grow up and go to law school, and make real money because, of course, that first job, I think I was making like $16,000 a year or something. Um, but I didn't, just because I kept, especially in those early days of
Right.
journalism, we were the only ones who had the wires. We were the only ones who knew what was going on in the world. None of this stuff was online. It's sort of hard to remember, but we were this fabulous in the know club. And I spent almost none of my time in the office, right? I was always out reporting, and I then went to Louisville and became their cop reporter. And again, I spent all my days at crime scenes, at fires, at all that sort of stuff out amongst the people, which was fabulous. Went then to Hazard and was their Eastern Kentucky correspondent, and covered 42 counties in Kentucky. And again, on the road all the time, almost never in the office. And I love that. And then I, went to the Wall Street Journal. It kind of, as you climb the ladder in journalism, it gets less fun, right? And probably the least fun and the least important job I had was as a White House correspondent for the New York Times, because by then you're just a transcriber of what's in front of you, and there are 100 other people taking identical transcriptions. So you're neither original nor are you, I think, all that important to the process. But I wanted to do it, I wanted to sort of see what that was like. I wanted to fly on Air Force One. But then I was a diplomatic correspondent, and, again, like you end up talking to a lot of talking heads instead of real people. And this book had been sort of burning a hole in my intestines for years and years and years. And so I finally left daily journalism to write it. And it took me 5 years.
No doubt. I mean, I could totally tell. I mean, I was going to ask you how long it took you, and 5 years is for sure a lot of time, and it takes that much. But at the Wall Street, when you were at Wall Street, you were covering pharma essentially. I mean,
I
that's where
was.
you start. Yeah, I mean,
So I was their lead farmer reporter, and then I became the New York Times' lead farmer reporter. So I
right,
knew all the companies. I knew
right.
nearly all the CEOs. I would have coffee and dinners and lunches with all the CEOs when they came through New York, or then when I went to Washington, when I was in Washington. Um, and I'm sure we're going to get into, this book is not a big pharma book. This book is a book about Johnson and Johnson, and um, and I sort of push back on these big pharma books because the industry has certainly had a record amount of criminality across it, right? I mean, something like 350 different guilty pleas, uh, $25 billion in fines. I mean, no industry has ever gone through this spate of sort of criminal behavior as big pharma. But I also think that there are some companies that are pretty good. In fact, it was always kind of amazing to me, Chadi, how stupid I often was when I came into various beats. Like when I became the Louisville cop reporter, the people I thought were the good guys and the bad guys when I first came into the beat were completely reversed by the time I left the beat. And in fact, I ended up getting the chief of police indicted and fired. And I thought the people around that particular chief, I thought they were great. And then I subsequently sort of realized, oh my God, they're all corrupt. It's just that they knew that I was a threat. So they befriended me and kind of sung and danced me from the get-go, and I fell for it. And to some extent that was true when I came into the pharma beat. For me, Johnson and Johnson was obviously the most ethical company in the industry. I'd grown up part of my life in Princeton, New Jersey, which is near the headquarters there in New Brunswick. I'd known families whose fathers and mothers worked at Johnson and Johnson. They were very proud of it, and I had internalized the sort of the mythology of Johnson and Johnson as one of the most ethical companies in the world. That the kind of capitalist nirvana where you could do well and do good at the same time. And I had all kinds of other ideas about the industry that turned out to be completely wrong. But probably the most important was where Johnson and Johnson stood in that moral hierarchy in the industry. And I soon sort of, and we can talk about the various things that really changed my mind, but I soon came to believe that, Johnson and Johnson was, and I think remains to this day, one of the great contradictions in American capitalism, that it, on the one hand, is seen as this extraordinary ethical company with arguably the first mission statement. And on the other hand, I think is actually one of the most deadly human organizations in history, and where crime is the rule, not the exception.
So you actually tell us that you met somebody at an airport and you're watching some college football game and you met that lady and you started exchanging some banters about the football, and then she says a couple of things and it struck you. Was that a catalyst event that made you decide I'm going to write the book, or were you already thinking about writing the book because of other reasons and this was like, okay, I'm done. I mean, take me through what were the actual events that made you decide, okay, I'm going to actually literally spend day and night investigating this and writing a book.
So, Chadi, again, I need to emphasize just sort of what a slow learner I am and how sort of stupid I was and how long it sort of took me to get to this moment. The first was, when I first came onto the beat in 1999, the big controversy at the time, you may remember, was the AIDS in Africa one.
Right.
The industry had come up with these cocktails of antiretrovirals that had turned AIDS from a killer into a chronic illness. But of course, the African continent was now hugely infected, and they couldn't have, there was almost no one in Africa that could afford these medicines. This controversy erupted. Somehow we have to get these medicines to Africa. I wrote a number of stories. My colleagues wrote a number of stories. The industry finally agreed to allow Indian generic companies like Cipla, run by an old friend of mine, Yusuf Hamid, to copy their intellectual property. And as Yusuf Hamid eventually announced, they were able to get the price of this triple therapy of ARVs down to below $1 a day. And once they got it there, the Bush administration stepped up with PEPFAR, the United Nations started UNAIDS, and the world knew that Africa would survive. And so all of the companies, of course, that were the biggest makers of these drugs agreed to provide their intellectual property to UNAIDS so that they could save Africa. all except Johnson and Johnson. Johnson and Johnson was the sole major manufacturer of ARVs who said, no, we're not doing it. We're not participating. And it was one of those things when I
Hmm.
first came on the beat, I was just like, I can't, I don't even understand this. Like, how is this possible? This is the most ethical company in the world, and it's not participating in this huge global effort to save Africa? Like, what? And I just thought it must have been just sort of one-off stupidity. And then and then actually my own son is born several years later. He spends the first 4 days of his life in a NICU unit. And anyone who's been through that knows that
I have.
it is one of the most awful experiences that humans go through. This creature who you just met suddenly has his hands wrapped around the taproot to your soul.
It was
And
very, very difficult. One of my boys was in the NICU for 10 days, and it was the most traumatic experiences I've ever had. Like you just meet the person
yeah,
and you go through this range of emotions that you just don't know what they are.
yeah, and he was my first too. And so I was sort of disbelieving at how, as you say, traumatic it was for me. We finally got him home. This is back in the day where there was no such thing as paternity leave. So,
Mhm.
like, as soon as I get him settled back in our apartment in New York, I go
Right.
back to work. And within days, I get this tranche of documents that shows that Johnson and Johnson had this secret and illegal marketing program to sell Propulsid, a heartburn drug, to NICU units, even though it knew two things. One, it had actually taken 20 separate pediatric clinical trials to test Propulsid, and every single one had failed. A spectacular record of failure. In fact, as you know, children are a protected class in medical research, and you are only allowed to test medical products in them if you have a very good reason to believe that it's going to be a positive experience. And they shouldn't have been allowed ethically to test Propulsid after they'd failed 3 times. They failed 20 times. So, this spectacular record of unethical research conduct on the one hand, they knew solidly, better than almost anyone has ever known, that this drug is not going to work for kids. They also knew solidly that this drug had a QT prolongation problem, which in preemies and neonates is a particularly bad problem. It causes heart arrhythmia, and in preemies, as you know, they're hanging on by gossamer threads to life, and having a heart arrhythmia could send them over the edge into death. And so Johnson and Johnson was, again, there was no pediatric indication for this drug. They nonetheless underwrote this illegal secret marketing campaign to sell it to NICU units. They were so successful that 1 in 5 preemies born in the late 1990s was prescribed Propulsid. 1 in 5 NICU patients. And the result was this growing pile of dead babies that they knew about. And in fact, the FDA was becoming increasingly alarmed about it, kept going to Johnson and Johnson. Why is this happening? And Johnson and Johnson was like, we don't know. We don't know why NICU units are using this, even though they did know because they were the ones underwriting this illegal marketing effort. So anyway, they finally had to basically withdraw the drug from the market. It was put in this special access program. And I get these documents just after my own son has been in a NICU unit, and I just,
Who sent you the documents?
well, I can't
Oh
reveal
no,
that.
but somebody like sent you documents.
Yeah.
Okay, okay.
So, and I'm
It's
like,
not I was
how
wondering
is
if like
this?
your son was getting Propulsid and you saw this on their prescription as part
No,
of
no,
that.
no. He
Okay,
thankfully he was born after Propulsive was put in this
got
special
it.
access program. But I was like, having just been in a NICU unit,
Right.
having just been, vulnerable to this very thing, I was like, how is this possible? And then I have that meeting in the airport with the sales rep, and I just and then of course the company pleads guilty to extraordinary criminal charges, worse than any other criminal charges, although it didn't get quite the attention because Johnson and Johnson delayed so long in its guilty plea that by the time they pleaded guilty, so many, including Pfizer, all the other makers of atypical antipsychotics had pleaded guilty, so it wasn't really news. But I began to see Johnson and Johnson as this uniquely problematic company in the American healthcare space, even though it is also the largest medical products company. As you know, they have one of the
Right.
largest pharmaceutical um, uh, businesses. They have the largest medical device business that, until recently, they had a very large consumer products business. And so, this is the Goliath. And among the many stories we're going to talk about, as you know, in the book, what I do is I walk through multiple different products. I talk about Johnson's baby powder and how they knew it was contaminated with asbestos for decades. I talk about Tylenol, and there's recent news about Tylenol. I've had some involvement in that, and why that drug is such a terrible drug, and how Johnson and Johnson has sort of gotten away with this basically for 70 years. And then I would love to talk to you about EPO, which was for many years the biggest selling drug in cancer. And I think the EPO disaster really shows how corrupt the cancer business can be, and frankly is to this day. And then I talk about Risperdal and the atypical antipsychotics, and metal-on-metal hip implants, vaginal mesh, and finally the COVID vaccine. But with each one of these cases, the top three cases, which is, oh, and I forgot even, there's opioids. And, the story, Chadi, that everybody knows, which is that Purdue Pharma and the Sacklers caused the opioid crisis, is just dead wrong. During the prescription opioid crisis, which was really the first 10 years of that crisis, about 10% of the bodies that showed up in morgues had a Purdue Pharma product in their system. 60% had a J&J product in their system. J&J was far more important to that disaster than Purdue Pharma, and yet they are never mentioned. Why is it that you believe this story that is just wrong? I saw all these portrayals for so long, and I was just like, I cannot live with this. And that's when I quit and decided to write the book.
And I want to start, maybe I'll start with the pain thing because it was pretty new to me. It was interesting because whenever the opioid crisis is mentioned, all I think of is Purdue Pharma.
Everybody's that way.
I've read the book Dope Sick. I've actually had three podcast episodes on that. But it's interesting. I'll tell you, when I was a resident in the mid 90s, we were told that pain is the fifth vital sign.
Sure.
It was embedded in our brain. That's
Right.
what I was taught. So when I would go into the patient's room as an internal medicine resident, I must ask about the pain. And actually, it would have on the board, it will be to remind me to ask.
Right.
And I had to document that. And my job was to make sure that there is no pain. And I was taught that OxyContin is extremely safe.
Right.
And I guess the only saving grace I always try to console myself is that the majority of the patients I took care of, they indeed had a lot of cancer-related pain. They were not the usual post-op pain or things like that. So I had to console myself like this. But I can tell you that the teaching was as such. And I struggled with this a lot because we'll talk about Procrit as well. But since we talked about the pain, this was very challenging for me with this. But then I'm reading your book, and you're talking about the Regisic and so on. I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't think anybody knows about this. Like I did not know. So
Right.
why do you think people just associated with Purdue and they had no clue that Duragesic is part of the whole thing?
Well, and let's be clear, Duragesic is fentanyl.
Fentanyl, yeah,
Fentanyl is a Johnson and Johnson drug. Like
right.
They discovered it, they developed it, they brought it to market. You know, I obviously was a daily journalist for some 35 years. You are now, you have been a journalist for some time, Chadi, on this. And, you know, the stories you are able to tell are the stories that people read, right? And the stories you are able to tell often um, are the ones that are the easiest to tell. So Purdue Pharma was a one product company. It did not have consultants in every single academic medical center like Johnson and Johnson did and does. It did not have one of the largest lobbying organizations on Capitol Hill. Probably most importantly, it didn't have an enormous, huge consumer advertising budget that meant it was extraordinarily influential at every major media organization, every TV station, every newspaper. Johnson and Johnson had all of those. So I can tell you that as the pharma reporter for the New York Times, it was vastly more difficult to do an investigative story and cost me far more internally to do an investigative story about Johnson and Johnson than it was to do investigative stories about Purdue and the Sacklers. Now, the New York Times has a particularly bad history with the opioid crisis that I could sort of get into. The Times really turned away from that story in a substantive way after my colleague Barry Meyer really did like landmark stories in 2001 about Purdue Pharma and the Sacklers. And for a variety of internal reasons, the Times basically never again did any really good stories on the causes of the opioid crisis, although I tried again and again and again to break through. But, you know, I can tell you that Johnson and Johnson worked my editors and complained all the way up through the chain of the New York Times when I wrote about them in a way almost no other company did or succeeded at. So why haven't you heard about the Johnson and Johnson? Like, you know, Chadi, as you know, nearly all books tell you stories you already know, especially business
Right.
books. You know, 90% of business books are like about, say, Amazon, why Amazon took over the world. You already know that Amazon has taken over the world. And you read these books to kind of give you more details and to summarize a bunch of stories you've already read. And then maybe 9.9% of books are about why this company blew up. You know, what happened to Boeing? Why those planes crashed? What happened to General Electric? Why it went from the most valuable company in the world to sort of a mess? What what my book does is very unusual, which is that you think you know the Johnson and Johnson
Right.
story, and I'm telling you actually the story is just the opposite. And and I, you know, it, it's been a problem for the book's launch. You know, the New York Times has never reviewed it, despite the fact that I worked at the highest levels there for many years. The Wall Street Journal has never reviewed it. And I think for a lot of them, it's just they don't really know what to do with this. It's like, wait a second. Could this be right? You know, I accuse Johnson and Johnson in the book of being responsible for more than 2 million American deaths. That is more death and injury than all of the wars in all of American history combined. And I provide the epidemiology for these stories to do that. And so what I am essentially saying is that I am telling you about the three largest, costliest, and deadliest criminal conspiracies in American history. And except, you know, and you've already heard about the opioid crisis, although what you think you know is wrong. But you have almost certainly never heard about these other ones. One is the EPO one that I
Well,
hope you know,
the EPO
and the
one,
other is the antipsychotics one.
well, the EPO one you actually you mention, and that struck me, is that statistically, the number of people that died from EPO is higher than the number of people that died from the opioid crisis.
It's about the same. Yeah,
Yeah,
but
or
yeah,
close.
they're basically equivalent. And you've heard nothing but huge amounts of TV and everything about opioids, and you've never heard about EPO. The
Right,
only thing most people know about EPO is that Lance Armstrong and the US Postal
right.
team used it to dope and win 7 Tours de France. And that, of course, happened. But what nobody really seems to understand about EPO is that it was the biggest selling cancer drug in the United States for 15 years. It was the single largest expense of the federal government for most of that period of time. So it was an enormous seller. It was, if you have a family member who died of cancer during the administrations of Bill Clinton or George W. Bush, there's a better than 50% chance that Johnson and Johnson either caused their death outright or sped their death.
Yeah, and I prescribed EPO a lot,
Yeah,
Gardner.
I'll
I
bet you
mean,
did.
I think it's, I mean, the reason these two stories, the specifically the EPO and the pain ones, hit home for me because I have been a prescriber of both. And when you do that, you obviously think you're doing great for patients. And then you realize, oh my gosh, I didn't know, but it didn't matter. I mean, I definitely prescribe. I mean, I'm for sure have given Procrit to people that should have never gotten it, and more than, and it's hard to. This is very difficult to resolve. Now,
Right.
I'm a firm believer science evolves, like, even in my book, Toxic Exposure, I talk about, well, people smoked cigarettes and doctors advertised for it, and then they knew. And I make the contrast and the argument, well, we thought glyphosate is great, and we found that it's not. But what's so striking in your book is that you actually bring evidence that is very compelling
Well, I have the
that,
grand jury files
right, I
for
mean,
these
exactly. That's
investigations.
the
So I have
difference. That,
sworn testimony
yeah, you have sworn
that's never
testimony,
been made public. It's all
right,
secrets.
right.
Yeah.
And it shows that we knew and we did not really share that. And that's really big. So you struck me
And
when
by the
you,
way, Chadi, I
yeah,
wanted to say, like, there's so many parallels with your book because
yeah,
what nobody really remembers is that Monsanto was actually back in the day one of the good guys. I mean,
yeah,
remember that they talked about genetically modified crops as answering so many of the world's problems.
yeah,
Like, remember, they were talking about doing genetic modification so you could use less herbicide, less pesticide. They were going to create these crops that could resist pests naturally. And of course, they were going to create salt resistant rice crops for Bangladesh to really feed a hungry world. These were all the promises. And the promises were so great that they really were seen as one of the good guys. And of course, what they end up doing is all of their genetic modifications for Roundup ready crops was so that you could use more
right,
herbicide. And
right,
as you write in your book, the result was, a 15-fold increase in the use of Roundup over, the period of time that you're talking about. So suddenly these rural places are absolutely swimming in this
right,
toxic herbicide because of the genetic modifications that they've made. So the promise is it turns out to be the curse. And Johnson and Johnson, this story really is very similar. Johnson and Johnson was one of the good guys. It truly was an ethical company in, the early part of the 20th century, and it was baby powder as they began to realize that baby powder was contaminated with asbestos and they started hiding this. And as the research grew, to prove that even microscopic amounts of asbestos could cause mesothelioma, a cancer of the lining of the lung, they started hiding all the documents, lying about it, even in court. And that became the ladder down which they climbed to do a series of spectacularly unethical things with a whole bunch of other products. And to me, like your your experience with opioids and EPO on the one hand is so interesting. E opioids, of course, is seen in the Sacklers as the apotheosis of corporate greed, as the worst possible thing that happened. That's not true at all. Remember, Chadi, that for many of your patients, particularly the ones near death, your opioid prescriptions were exactly the right thing to do. If you're in pain, there's nothing better than an opioid for fixing it. Opioids are incredibly effective treatment. EPO, which was sold as this sort of general pick-me-up that would help you with cancer, there is no benefit for cancer patients. It, in fact, is miracle grow to tumors. So for your cancer patients, giving them EPO did the opposite of what most of your patients did. So while we see the opioid crisis as the top of corporate greed, it really wasn't. Opioids it's really hard to pick out the opioid patients who really shouldn't have gotten this drug from those who should, right? Obviously, Purdue Pharma and J&J, pushed opioids into a whole group of patients with moderate pain for whom the risks of the drug did not balance out the benefits. In EPO, there shouldn't have been a single one of your patients who got that drug.
Yeah.
It killed them. There was no benefit. So that's why, this book, many of the books about opioids like Empire of Pain and all that, they're wonderful books, but they fail to really put this behavior in a larger context of the healthcare system. And that's why I wanted to do the book about Johnson and Johnson, so that you can actually see, opioids, there was nothing really unusual that was going on in the opioid crisis. And arguably, these other criminal conspiracies, first of all, cost more lives. As I say in the book, the atypical antipsychotic criminal conspiracy costs at least 1 million people. To this day, prescription opioids kill about 20,000 Americans a year. Atypical antipsychotics to this day kill 60,000, 3 times that number a year. So it's a much bigger disaster. It's caused much more lives, and you've never heard of it.
And with the Procrit, just to hone on last point, because I want to go back to some other stories, physicians, oncologists, and nephrologists made a lot of money from Procrit.
Huge amounts
There
of money. It
was there was a
basically
lot
doubled
of
their take-home pay. And this
rebates.
is,
It's crazy.
and look, I know many of the investigators. Obviously, I have the grand jury files. One of the things that comes out of the investigation of EPO is there were two things going on, right? Johnson and Johnson was undertaking all these clinical trials, finding out that EPO was deadly, and then keeping those results secret, not only from doctors like you, but even from the FDA. Completely illegal, outrageous. But they were also, to encourage doctors like you to prescribe
Right.
EPO, they were adding 15% extra to their vials that they didn't charge you for. And then they taught you and your colleagues how to charge Medicare and private insurers for that free EPO as if you had paid full freight. And so what cancer hospitals across the country did was hire compounding pharmacies to repackage the EPO so they could more efficiently capture the free EPO and engage in massive insurance fraud. And so if you're hiring a compounding pharmacy for this product, you are knowingly engaging in insurance fraud. And nearly every major cancer center in the country did this. So when I talk to the investigators, they're like, Gardner, the entire cancer community was engaged in this knowingly engaged in this criminal conspiracy. What were we supposed to do? Arrest every oncologist in the country? Because the money was so good. The average oncologist during this period of time was making $300,000 in their practice, and they were making $300,000 prescribing EPO alone. So EPO by itself doubled oncologists' take-home pay. And this reveals why, to this day, oncology is the second most corrupt form of medicine. First is, by far and away, orthopedics. But it's because you guys serve as both physician and pharmacist, and much of your income comes from these drug markups. And so your financial interests are in giving patients as much intensive chemotherapy as possible. And that is why, to this day, patients at Memorial Sloan Kettering and MD Anderson, do you know what the average amount of time that a patient at one of those hospitals spends on hospice?
I don't.
Do you give me a
I
guess?
mean, I think nationally, I'm not talking MD Anderson
Yeah,
Memorial.
sure.
Nationally, it's usually about 3 days or less.
Yeah, it's 18 hours.
Yeah.
So why? Well, oncologists will say patients want to fight till the end. All it's bullshit. It's because that's where the money is. And if oncologists no longer made much of their income from drug markups, I will guarantee you that the amount of time that patients spend on hospice
Yeah.
would go up tenfold.
Uh,
Because what's happening now is that cancer hospitals and oncologists are treating dead people. They are pumping patients full of these toxic chemotherapeutics until far past the point when they know that this patient is going to die.
but we have to agree that this hopefully is the exception, not the rule. I'll defend
In oncology, it's
oncologists.
not. I'm sorry.
Do you think
It's
so?
oh my God. I mean,
No,
that's
but
why.
do you think if we take 15,000 oncologists, do you think the majority of these oncologists are engaging in the behavior of over-prescribing for financial gains, or do you think that's the minority of the oncologists?
Oh, I think it's the vast, vast, vast majority. Now, I don't think it's a conscious process. Look, the way conflicts of interest work is that your unconscious mind nudges your conscious mind into making decisions that will benefit your wallet. If your wallet depends on you believing something, you will believe it. And the reason that oncology is such a different animal in the United States versus Europe. Remember, American oncologists prescribe 3 times as much EPO as European oncologists because European oncologists didn't get the drug markups. They didn't make $300,000 a
I
year
agree with
prescribing.
the EPO piece. I mean, the EPO piece, I am fully on board with
But
you, and
Chuddy,
I
this continues to this day. The average cancer medicine
no,
now.
the reason I think EPO is a bit different, because I think we never viewed it as chemotherapy. We viewed it as this is going to help people feel better.
Right.
They're going to get more energy and so on.
Sure.
I don't think, at least I haven't seen, I can't really speak for everybody. Certainly there are stories in the press and there are some oncologists that got prosecuted and went to jail. But certainly I haven't seen somebody prescribe, I'm going to give adriamycin or
Oh, no, no,
Cytoxan
no.
or,
And I don't mean to imply that there is,
but the Procrit, yes, the Procrit was
I do
over
think Procrit was unique for a bunch of reasons.
for
But,
sure.
let's be clear. Oncologists have massive financial incentives
Agreed.
to prescribe their patients very expensive chemotherapeutics until that patient's heart stops.
Yeah.
That's the system that we have right now. Their financial incentives are all geared toward overtreatment. I mean, we can agree on that, right? And the result is that patients are being treated with these toxic and expensive chemotherapeutics, which, by the way, for many patients, they have to spend, in the Medicare program, 20% of the cost of these things. So it's a huge amount of money that's coming out of their own pockets. And what do you tell me, Chadi, if these financial incentives were not there, do you
I
really think that the date at which chemotherapeutics stopped wouldn't be considerably earlier than it is now?
You're hitting on a topic that I'm extremely interested in, and I think we're probably 90% in agreement, which is
Okay,
behavioral economics, right? I mean, at the end of the day,
exactly.
what you're describing is an entire field of behavioral economic, gaming, nudging, all of that stuff that I
Yep.
think is well established, researched. I mean, Danny Kahneman and Richard Thaler won Nobel Prize of
Good for you
behavioral
for knowing the
economics.
names.
I've read all of their books. So I agree with that.
Okay,
I think I also agree with you that I think we have this internal process in our mind where we rationalize, right? I mean, in
sure.
other words, you would say, well, I was going to prescribe this anyway,
Exactly.
right?
Even though that's nonsense.
So, and it's possibly that's because we just rationalize this. So I think the idea of money and behavioral economics is well established. And I actually wrote a paper one time on behavioral economics in how physicians decide to prescribe biosimilars, as an example. I'll send it to you. Just it's a fun read. I
Sure.
tried to contrast this and that. But I think that my hope at least, and I don't have any stats, that in every profession there's the good and bad. There are good lawyers, good journalists, bad journalists, good doctors, bad doctors, good carpenters, bad carpenters. I would hope that there are more good oncologists than bad oncologists, I
Oh,
guess.
listen, I've many oncologists have been my dearest and dearest of friends. It's just that, when I was a journalist, I couldn't take a ham sandwich from any of these companies that I covered. Um, and if you're in a big company, you can't take money from your suppliers
Right.
because it sets up these obvious conflicts of interest. Unfortunately, in medicine,
It's different.
those sort of standard ethical constructs are absent.
Yeah.
Huge numbers of doctors are part-time drug sales reps,
But are
right?
you seeing some changes to that? Like, are you seeing some, for example, the drug lunches, there's some like more guardrails now into the interaction, I guess, because ultimately we have to think of solutions or what are the guardrails. So I have a couple of questions here. Number one, where's the FDA in all of this? I mean, at the end of the day,
Right
we
where
can we
Congress
can we can
wants them.
agree, but we can agree that the FDA label. Now, you can always do off-label stuff, and I think you mentioned it in your book artfully. It is so well
Sure.
written. I loved it. I think it should be read by everyone. But also, when you get the FDA stamp and the
Right.
label,
Right.
it's really allowing you to do a lot of things. So, do you think the FDA over the past 30 years could have done a better job, and what could they have done differently?
So we sold the FDA to the industry in 1992, right? In 1992, David Kessler, then the commissioner of the FDA, because of the AIDS crisis, there was this huge hue and cry that the FDA was taking too long to approve drugs. Remember, ACT
Yeah.
UP, the AIDS advocacy group, protested outside of the FDA, threw red colored paint on the walls like it was blood, like that these delays were costing lives. And so Congress was not going to give FDA the money it needed to speed its review times. So David Kessler took what he thought was the only step that he could take, but turned out to be a sort of a terrible one for the FDA writ large, which is that he decided to take fees from drug makers. And the 1992 deal sold parts of FDA to the industry. It was really the 1997 deal in which the FDA sort of sold itself heart and soul. And so what happened is that the FDA became almost solely focused on fast approvals of drugs and devices. And the FDA basically stopped monitoring the impact of these drugs and devices once they were on the market. Remember, the way we deal with this with airplanes is that the FAA approves airplanes, but when there's a crash, the NTSB, an entirely separate and independent group of people, comes in and investigates it. What we have is the FDA approving all these devices, and then supposedly the FDA is then supposed to police this industry that's also, by the way, paying its salaries. What I show in my book is that this post-approval process has gone away entirely at the FDA. The FDA still has criminal investigators. I have no idea what they've done for the last 35 years. None of the criminal charges in any of the Johnson and Johnson cases or any of the other cases have resulted from the FDA. In fact, in most of these cases, the FDA resisted prosecutors' efforts to go after what the FDA sees as their partners. Speeches given by top FDA officials nearly always open in industry conferences by saying, you are our most important customers. It's not the American people who are their customers, it's the industry who's their customers. So when you ask where the FDA is, the FDA is exactly where we sold them, which is to the pharmaceutical industry. And that's their most important customer. And those are the people. And I tell the story of the 2012
Yeah.
fee negotiations in which FDA Commissioner Peggy Hamburg was having trouble. She reached out directly to Johnson and Johnson's CEO and said, "I need help." He, got the industry on board, got J&J's lobbyists to get it through Congress rapidly, and he saved the jobs of hundreds of FDA medical officers. And perhaps not coincidentally, in the subsequent months, the FDA didn't charge any Johnson and Johnson executives with criminality in their antipsychotic case, despite the fact that it cost 1 million American lives. They didn't require Johnson and Johnson to withdraw their knowingly dangerous metal on metal hip implant or vaginal mesh. They took the softest line on J&J again and again and again and again, even though the agency knew that these were crimes, that it had cost tens, if not hundreds of thousands of lives, and nothing happened to Johnson and Johnson as a result.
Speaking of the FDA, there's a lot of press on Tylenol nowadays. You talk about Tylenol. I've seen the documentary on Netflix. I want to ask you about Tylenol and autism. It's hard not to ask you, did anybody reach out
Sure.
to you? Because you're like the Tylenol de facto expert now, Gardner.
Yeah.
Tell me about your thoughts of the Tylenol and autism and how, I mean, maybe that's your next book.
So obvious, I mean, I was the public health reporter for the New York Times, so I wrote about vaccines. I believe in vaccines. I famously wrote a 2005 piece that said that, claims that vaccines cause autism are just wrong. So there's no evidence that vaccines have contributed to the autism increase at all. There is a lot of science about Tylenol's impact here. Now, half the studies show no correlation, half the studies show significant correlation. So I think scientists, and I am not a scientist, I'm a science journalist, but I see that there are reputable, good researchers on both sides of this question. Some who believe that there is a clear correlation with Tylenol, that Tylenol has a causation. Remember, Tylenol basically acts like a cannabinoid, like marijuana. That's its analgesic effect. It's not a particularly good analgesic, and it has an enormous amount of toxicity, mostly liver toxicity. But it works that way. And as we know, cannabinoids cause psychosis, cause all kinds of mental problems. So there is a clear mechanistic theory about how Tylenol could contribute to autism, and there are really good people on both sides of this question. Now, I can tell you that if I was married to somebody who was pregnant at this point, I would tell her in no uncertain terms, like, we don't know what's really going on here, but don't take any Tylenol if you don't have to. And the thing is, 70% of pregnant women in the United States take Tylenol at some point in their pregnancy.
Right.
Only 6% of them take it to treat fevers. So a huge share of the use of Tylenol is just this routine analgesic effect. And if Tylenol was a good analgesic, that might be worth the risk. But it's a terrible analgesic, which is why the vast majority of people take extra strength Tylenol. Extra strength Tylenol is 500 milligrams of acetaminophen. No one should have access to a pill with 500 milligrams of acetaminophen. The FDA in 2011, changed the allowable amount of acetaminophen in prescription pills down to 325 milligrams. You cannot get a prescription pill that has more than 325 milligrams of acetaminophen, and yet you can go to the pharmacy and buy over the counter a 500 milligram pill.
My
The
mom
reason
takes it.
the FDA did this is that, over-the-counter medicines have this monograph process the FDA has very little power over. And what the FDA was doing was trying to shame Johnson & Johnson in taking extra strength Tylenol off the market. As we know, Johnson & Johnson has no shame, kept this pill on the market. And by the way, to this day, more people are injured and killed from acetaminophen than all other over-the-counter remedies combined. This is not a good drug. There is some evidence here. I think the Trump administration and my former colleagues at the top newspapers don't seem to agree. I think it made sense for them to sort of say, look, we're going to put a precaution on here. We're not sure where the science is because I'll tell you, Chadi, I was involved with COVID-19 and the politics. And if there is one thing we should have learned from COVID-19 is that people want to know the potential risks even when the science isn't clear. In fact, especially when the science isn't clear. What drives them nuts is the sort of paternalistic reassurance that we don't need to tell you anything because we're the smart people and you're kind of dumb, and we'll tell you stuff when we're certain about it. That was disastrous in COVID-19, and I don't think it's the way to handle Tylenol.
Um, You said the book has not been covered by the journal or by New York Times, and so it got me to think, did you ever get pushback against publishing it? Like, were people aware that you were writing this book that took you several years? And understandably, I mean, was there any campaign to say, how can we prevent Gardner from publishing the book?
Every day for 5 years.
How did this happen? Like, give me a flavor. How did
Well,
that
like
happen?
remember, and you know this, Chuddy, there are Johnson & Johnson consultants in every single major academic medical center. And many of these people are my friends. And, I've been doing this beat in one way or another for some 20 odd years. Yes, I kind of lost my mind and became a White House correspondent and a foreign correspondent and a diplomatic correspondent, but I still always kept my hand a little bit in this space because it's so important. And, for 5 years, I would call up these friends and say, I'm doing this book. And they would say, you're out of your mind. And I'll never forget. There's you know the atypical antipsychotic story that I tell, we haven't really gotten into. There are a few people who are the most expert in this, and I called one of these experts, an old friend of mine, and said, I'm doing a back of the envelope calculation here, and I've got like 1 million deaths. Could that possibly be right? And this person said, oh, no, no, Gardner, I think you're way off. And I was like, oh, do you think it's 500,000, 250,000? And this person said, no, I think it's about 6 times the number you quoted.
Oh my
And I was like,
God.
wait, you think 6 million people have
Oh my
died?
God.
And this person said, plus or minus 1 million? Yeah. And I was like, and you didn't think that would be news? You didn't think you should like publish on that? And this person said, do you know what kind of lawyers these people have? Which is true. Johnson & Johnson has spent $35 billion on litigation expenses since 2013. That's roughly tenfold more than the next biggest spender in the Fortune 50. Johnson & Johnson is basically a law firm with a drug unit attached and a device unit attached at this point. These guys have the toughest lawyers in the country. Almost every single major corporate law firm lists Johnson & Johnson as one of their top clients. So, yeah, did people wave me off this throughout this process? You better believe it. And I am so grateful for Random House, the largest book publisher in the world. I think only they could have been brave enough to take this on. Now, I had to go through huge legal reviews, a lot of blood on the
Yeah.
floor. There's a bunch of stuff that's not in the book that was originally in the book for legal reasons. But I give them an enormous amount of credit for publishing this book. Now,
Yeah.
I will tell you, and they don't really want me to talk about this stuff, their foreign subsidiaries are not publishing this. Like
Yeah.
it's not being published in England because the libel laws are different there.
Yeah.
So it is a great example of what the First Amendment brings us in the United States that other countries simply cannot get.
Yeah, my book went through a legal review as well. I know you have a hard stop. I don't want to let you go because I want to keep talking to you. But maybe I'll ask you just two quick couple of questions.
Sure.
Number one is what's next for you? What's next for you? Whether it is reporting, whether it is writing another book, and I don't know. I mean, I'll have to ask is what's. I mean, everything in the book is shocking. But probably what's the most shocking one? At least I'll tell you
Yeah.
the one that resonated with me more personally, more than
Yeah.
Procrit. I thought the antipsychotic one, I took so much double take in reading this because it's kids getting prolactin. It's just crazy. Tell me what's next for you, and what was the most shocking revelation that you've uncovered, you think?
Yeah. I don't have good answers to either one of your, they're great questions. Don't get me wrong. I'm just sort of coming out of this
You
intensive
need
book
to rest and
reading.
sleep.
And so I'm still sort of mulling what comes next. I've got a few possible irons in the fire. Um, and I'm sorry, what was the
Well,
second?
if you get a
Oh, what's the
docu-series,
worst of the
if you get
worst?
a docu-series on this, I expect to be part of it as an interview as an oncologist.
Sure.
But what's like the most shocking revelation? Like you just went into them like, oh my God, I can't believe this. Is there one thing that you could share with us?
Yeah, I mean, I
All of
think,
it.
yeah, I mean, again, it's sort of a footnote in the book, but the propulsant stuff where they're knowingly selling a deadly medicine to preemies, like all the stuff with babies. I mean, this is a company that describes itself as the baby company, and they knowingly sold products
Yeah.
like contaminated baby powder for babies, like that, like the antipsychotics, as you know, Risperdal, their antipsychotics should not have been given to kids. It's the only atypical
Right.
antipsychotic that causes boys to grow breasts. And it simply should not ever have
But
been given.
you also mentioned stuff that Lilly was doing. So it got
Yep,
me to think how much of what you're reporting with J&J is unique to J&J. I mean, you could write a book on Lilly probably, Nick. I mean, I'm being
I
honest, like, you
could.
know.
Well, what I think is really, look, I have the grand jury files on Lilly as well. And
Right.
what's really interesting about the two sets of grand juries is how much more successful Johnson and Johnson was in gaslighting its own employees.
Right.
Lilly's employees almost immediately started filing whistleblower complaints. And by the way, when Lilly confronted this, they called the guy in who'd been in charge of Zyprexa's sales and these illegal sales, and they fired him on the spot. Johnson and Johnson made that guy their CEO. Like
Alex Gorsky.
John, Alex Gorsky, Johnson and Johnson was in the middle of negotiating the final $2.2 billion fine for their criminal conduct with Risperdal. In the middle of this process, they then make the guy who did this whole thing their CEO. If that doesn't tell you everything you need to know about Johnson and Johnson, which is yes, it was criminal conduct. Yes, we're going to pay one of the largest fines in history. And we are now going to make the guy who was in charge of that our top guy. Whereas Lilly fired that guy. Now, it might have been unfair to him. The whole organization was going that way. But to me, that was an absolutely telling example of the two different cultures of Lilly and Johnson and Johnson.
Gardner, I could talk to you for another hour. I just have to respect your time because you did tell me and warn me about the hard stop that you have. And I'm very grateful for your time. I think the book, everybody should read it. I actually read it and listened to it in audio. And I think people can find anywhere. I mean, Barnes and Noble, Amazon, or you have a website as well that they can get. And
They can
I
get all
just,
the documents on my website.
yeah,
I've
I
got
mean, you have
thousands of internal
the
documents, hundreds of thousands of pages of trial transcripts, which you know very well from your book.
unbelievable.
And
Unbelievable.
I obviously have transcripts from more than a dozen different trials. You focus on one, which in many ways made your writing process a lot easier, I think. Mine, That
No,
was
I can
that's
tell you
why it
as a
surprised me.
reader, this is a story like you have I mean, you're a reporter, obviously, so your ability to do storytelling where I know there's a story and you put in the element, you weaved in so many actual stories of patients. I mean, the scene that you described of the whistleblower that has to wear the wire as she's going into a lecture, I'm like, oh my
Right,
gosh, this is crazy.
right.
So I was like watching a movie, a disturbing movie, but nonetheless, it's a
Well,
movie.
what was great about Nancy is that I talked to her and had her story, and then I had the grand jury files from
Right.
the investigator's point of view. So it was this neat thing where I could sort of tell the story from those two, from both of the investigators' point of view. I had her memos, and from Nancy's point of view. So it was just sort of a neat way of being able to tell that story. But I
And
really appreciate it, Toddy.
yeah,
I'm grateful that you
and the book
had
is
me.
doing great. It's a New York Times bestseller. So, I mean, come on. Excellent. Well,
All right.
congratulations on everything. I will talk to you some other time and then
Okay, great.
look forward to more conversations. Thank you, Gardner.
Okay. All right. Thank you.